morning, everyone. I think we might have a few people just arriving, but I'm here to welcome you. I'm Judy Sheridan, and I'm here to welcome you to our first meeting of 2023. A pretty exciting one. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot and find this a very interesting discussion today. I am going to read our land acknowledgement to start off our meeting. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Joanne Hunter, our host for today.
We believe that climate change is the existential crisis of our time. Our purpose is to bring lifelong learners together into the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss by providing learning opportunities to move from curiosity to knowledge to action. Our core value is respect for each other's journey toward a sustainable future for life on the planet. Individually, by reducing personal emissions, strengthening our relationships with the natural world, and using our voices and energy to advocate with decision makers. We'd like to start the program today with a few words from Jane Goodall.
Journey, this life of mine. This planet has filled me with the wonder of all living things, great and small. We cannot ignore this earth that surrounds us, that feeds us, shelters us, replenishes our bodies and our souls, and stretches our imaginations, where animals, plants, air, water, all care for us. We're all interconnected, people, animals, our environment. When nature suffers, we suffer. And when nature flourishes, we all flourish. I do believe in the possibility of a world where we can live in harmony with nature, but only if every one of us does our part to make that world a reality, so that when you look back over your journey, your life, you can truly say, I did make a difference.
So just to give you a little idea of what's coming up today, we have two guest speakers, and our focus is on biodiversity, as well as COP15 and COP27, which occurred in the fall, and you'll learn more about that later on today. We'll have time for questions at the end, and then we'll wind up with upcoming events. And at the end, as always, you're welcome to stay for a chat. And that's just an informal way of talking and getting to know each other. I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Justina Ray. Dr. Ray has been president and senior scientist of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada since its incorporation in 2004. In addition to overseeing the operations of this non-governmental organization, Justina is involved in research and policy activities associated with conservation-based planning, environmental assessment, and biodiversity conservation. She's been appointed to numerous government advisory panels related to species at risk and land use planning in Ontario and Canada. She is adjunct professor at the University of Toronto and Trent University. It is also an honor to introduce our second guest speaker, Mitchell Beer. Mitchell is the founding publisher and managing editor of The Energy Mix. Mitchell has worked as a journalist, commercial writer, sustainable energy and climate specialist, and is also the founder of a successful communications and content development firm, Smarter Shift, which he started 36 years ago. There's no doubt that one of his main passions has been to bring us the climate news you need, which he has been doing since founding the Energy Mix in 2014. As Mitchell says in describing the Energy Mix, we're a bit of an experiment in new media, using a journalist's commitment to facts and evidence as a tool to support faster, deeper emission cuts. So welcome, Justina and Mitchell. And we'll start with Justina's presentation.
I'm also very happy to join you from Tikaranto, which is trees standing in water is what it means. And as Joanna explained, it's the traditional territory of many nations. This is an important reminder for me personally, just because of living in Toronto in this intensely settled landscape. It's hard to remember the relationship between land and people, but it has occurred for millennia. I'm going to be talking today, as was just shown, about, just introducing you to the concept of biodiversity, which we all know about, but we don't maybe know not all the elements. What happened in December here in Canada at the Montreal COP, and why does any of this matter? First of all, we are on a daily basis reminded about the difficulties of climate, and the contrast with biodiversity is very important in this respect. Few people need a reminder these days about the climate crisis. Everyone experiences a climatic regime in their daily life, as it expresses itself as weather from one day to the next. The changes in weather condition are like a daily conversation at the water cooler when we have them. And so the notion of climate is really central to human life. We think and we hear about fires in the summer, floods, we experience them. And the good side to all of this is that it makes us think about the health of environment much more than we otherwise would, but it doesn't leave as much room for thinking about the other inhabitants with which we share the planet. And there are so many of them. And while many of us would consider ourselves animal lovers, for example, particularly for urbanized people, the welfare of the populations of these animals is very far and abstract from us. The loss of biodiversity that is happening, and I'll explain in a bit what all those elements, what that means, don't tend to affect us personally as much. There are exceptions to that, but we can't perceive biodiversity decline as well as we can see the changes in the warming climate that's occurring. We don't have that personal connection most of the time. And this is, in a nutshell, a really big distinction between climate and biodiversity. And what do I mean by biodiversity? It simply means life on Earth. While many people associate biodiversity with maybe species and tropical ecosystems where you have large, the highest number of species on the planet and so on, the term actually covers the whole spectrum of Earth's biological diversity, ranging from, the organization of actually genetic diversity within species, for which you need full distributions and full expressions of how they live on the planet. And also to the communities and animals that make up ecosystems. And many of us refer to biodiversity simply as nature, but that in and of itself isn't complete in the sense of really understanding, the variety of all of this that entails. And while the pace of climate change can be measured through global temperature rise, increasing greenhouse emissions, those are pretty simple metrics in the scheme of things. Understanding the extent of human-caused biodiversity loss is a much more difficult thing to do. It's made up of so many different components that measuring and requires measure in the field. And it's very, very different from the climate crisis in this respect as well. And this makes it very challenging for us to address it. The most dramatic way to think about biodiversity decline is with extinction. Species extinction is a concern to us for a long time. Extinction is dramatic because it really means the loss forever of a type of animal from the planet, or a type of ecosystem from the planet. And if we just limit ourselves to thinking about extinction, then it is important to understand that extinction rates are much more higher than the background level. So if we didn't have present pressures on biodiversity and loss, if you look at the bottom sort of dotted line that says background, you would understand that that's probably where we would be, even with the dramatic events of dinosaur loss and so forth. This is the kind of species loss we should be expecting over time. This simply means that animals are disappearing at a rate that much faster than would be otherwise. And add to that the fact that we as humans are very reluctant to call something extinct. It has to be gone for 50 years. And it's such a huge event, in a sense, that we are certainly underestimating this. But I would argue that extinction is really not the way to look about biodiversity, because really we need to think and focus on biodiversity decline and degradation. And this is a useful sort of picture of how this is displays geographically. The red are sort of where you have the higher proportion of species that are not in the same shape as they used to be, where they've experienced loss and decline based on our measures. Of course, this is not complete. And where the blue cool areas are areas where not so much loss has occurred. But Canada does not is also part of this picture. And that's very important to understand. And so the components of biodiversity that are losing and degrading, harder to understand and perceive and feel on a day-to-day basis, but all that we can measure makes it clear that this is happening. I also want to make the point that, we don't measure very well what's out there. We have 80,000 species in Canada. That's one element of biodiversity, over 80,000. That doesn't include bacteria. And we are only able to track a small handful of them, relatively speaking. So we've all heard of beetles, of course, but I'll bet most people in this audience have no idea that there are over 4,000 types of beetles in Ontario alone. And the gray that are in this graph are the different types of, in the different provinces, really show the proportion and how many species we really don't know anything about how they're doing. Some of them that we do track are doing relatively well. That's where the green, and then up on the top, there are some species of beetles that we have real concerns about. And that's probably the tip of the iceberg, is particularly considering how little we know. So it is important for us to understand that we're not even tracking most species in any kind of way that would allow us to really measure the extent of decline that's occurring. We do know, however, that ecosystems are disappearing. That's a little bit more straightforward for us to grasp. Ecosystems at a high level, for example, wetlands in Ontario have been in the news a great deal. They're an excellent illustration of loss of biodiversity, as is much of what's happened in Southern Ontario over the last 100 and even 50 years. We've lost 70% of our wetlands that used to be here, more than 90% of the original grasslands, and the forest cover went down from covering about 80% of the landscape 100 years ago to now about 20%. And what is there, a lot of that is in degraded form. And that doesn't talk about the very the more specialized ecosystems that are beneath this larger high-level description that I've just given you. We have quite a few unique ecosystems on the planet that are unique to Canada and do not exist elsewhere and are endangered. And so that is also part of the biodiversity and nature loss that we're experiencing. We're getting a much better understanding of the interconnections of all of this. Climate is really an expression of overshoot, ecological overshoot, if you will. And biodiversity and climate are thus very linked. They experience some of the same drivers. And a lot of that is inherent in land degradation and deforestation. We also understand more and more, particularly during the pandemic, how important the relationship between us, nature, and our well-being, human health, even the economy, is much more understood about how important it is. The way in which we experience biodiversity loss, again, it's a little bit indirect, but the services that biodiversity underpin, it's the Earth support system, include things like clean air, clean water, pollination. but the degradation exert risks on our health and economy. But we don't intuitively make that linkage. We will more and more, and many residents of the planet are directly in line of this biodiversity loss now, much more. For example, thinking about food and other aspects of health. In Canada, we did start hearing a lot about biodiversity in the media in December. It was in the news quite a lot, and a lot of this was explained by the fact that this COP15 Conference of the Parties, the 15th of them since 1992, was held in Montreal. There were 14,000 people that came from all over the world. At one point, 127 environment ministers from different countries were in attendance, and they came just before a big snowstorm. And that was at the Palais des Congrès, right in Montreal, and that did put some attention on biodiversity. So the COP was the Conference of the Parties of what's called the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that is, if I can get nerdy for a moment, what we call a multilateral environmental agreement. And quite simply, that's where nations of the world agree to address issues, and environmental agreements abound on this score that are not sufficient for them to address locally. One of the most famous and successful multilateral environmental agreements, and a good display of how these can work, is the Montreal Protocol that was instigated in 1987 because of ozone depletion. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a report from the UN that the ozone layer recovery is on track due to the success of the Montreal Protocol. That's something to celebrate. There's no way, if the nations of the world had not agreed collectively to cooperate on this problem, that this kind of success would have occurred. Multilateral agreements also have a long history. We've had one or another, Canada has had for over 100 years. One of the most famous examples of this is the bilateral agreement that we have with the US that was established in 1916, the Migratory Bird Treaty. Not many people know that really what drove all the concerns way back in the early 1900s was actually direct hunting of songbirds. These images on the left are ladies' hats with plumage that led to very discernible declines in many of our songbirds. And you can see the rampant, hunting and destruction that was exemplified by this industry. That galvanized the two countries to come together. And there was quite a lot of success in those early decades in terms of regulating hunting. You don't see this image anymore. However, since that, much more other insidious threats have taken center stage, like habitat destruction and so forth. And so the implementation of the treaty, which still is in play, is much more challenging, but it is useful to understand its origin. Some people talk about the global awakening that started in the 1970s. Rachel Carson's famous Silent Spring in the 60s kind of led to that. And it was really what people might describe in a nutshell when countries recognize that, many of the problems which we consider local are really global problems and require this cooperation, as I described for the ozone layer. And the first expression of this was in 1972. And it was the first United Nations on the Human Environment held in Stockholm, Sweden. And it was actually led by Maurice Strong, a Canadian. And that precipitated a lot of cooperation. The other event that happened in 1992 was the Rio Convention. And, this was when increasing recognition that climate change and biodiversity were already causing severe impacts for people. And both the UN Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity were born at this time. So they were both cut from the same cloth, both spawned in 1992, but there are some very key differences between them that I don't have time to go into. But suffice it to say that the Climate Change Convention is several steps ahead of the CBD. And this generally because it follows a harder legal approach, which has evolved over the years of implementation. And it has more robust mechanisms to enhance compliance. But, you'll see that it's not, it hasn't been sufficient by any stretch, but it's still ahead of the CBD. And the evolution of the implementation of the treaty has happened at a much faster pace. Nevertheless, the fact that they were born at the same convention is something we should remind ourselves all the time of. Digging deeper into the Convention on Biological Diversity, an important high-level point is that it has three objectives that are somewhat conflicting at times. So it not only deals with the conservation of biological diversity, so stemming the tide of the threats and loss that is occurring and has been occurring, but it also acknowledges that biodiversity is very important for people, and so it has to also include sustainable use and then also equitable sharing of benefits. It's important to keep these in mind, that there are these three objectives which underpin many things. There were several strategies over the years, mostly decadal strategies, but there was a pivotal time just before the pandemic when this report on the left by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity released its first global assessment on biodiversity. Many people know what IPCC is, the International Panel of Climate Change, which is its analog on the climate side, but nothing had ever been done of those reports. They'd already, by 2019, done 5 or 6 of those reports. So IPBES report in 2019 grabbed a lot of headlines. Headlines like, 1 million species are threatened with extinction, but also the report laid out very good evidence based on, thousands of research and many scientists who cooperated from around the world, that of the direct connections between human well-being and biodiversity condition. Shortly after that, the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the 5th one, was published, which showed that the strategy that had just been developed was not successful. Barely any of the targets even had qualified progress. So we were not in a good shape. And that was right around the time that the pandemic hit. The work was already underway at that time to develop a new 10-year strategy. This is what we're calling the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the idea, based on the lessons that we learned, to have much more precise, quantifiable targets, track progress, bring in more accountability. You don't have to worry too much about the details, except that the bottom line here is that the whole process and road to adopt this framework, which was the next strategy for 2030, has been underway for a long time. It started in 2018, and then right in the middle of the planning, the pandemic occurred, brought everybody virtual. And at the end of the day, the last COP was where this was going to be adopted originally in 2020, had to be postponed by 20 years. And this is where we were in Montreal. It took a long time to get to December 2022. And one of the really key points was June 20th of this year, when negotiations were finally happening in person, but a huge decision was made for Canada to replace China as the venue for the UN Biodiversity Summit, given the zero COVID policy at the time. This was a huge undertaking for Canada, a big responsibility. That meant that a COP had to be planned in a 6 or 5 month period, where normally countries have 2 years, hosts have 2 years for this. Also, another challenge was that China maintained its position as the presidency. And so this is why the framework that emerged from this is called the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. And it was adopted in the wee hours of the morning of December 19th. The framework sets out 4 global goals to achieve by 2050 and 23 targets. It has a mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, which sits underneath a broader 2050 vision to live in harmony with nature. The framework itself achieved agreement, consensus, by 195 countries, 187 were present, I believe. This is no small feat. And the strength of the framework is quite significant, given, particularly given the need for consensus and the huge negotiations that were involved. It takes all sorts of facets of biodiversity into account, looking at threats, implementation, and so forth. And really, the framework is very complex as a result. Most people have heard of the most famous target, which is now called Target 3, which is to conserve and protect at least 30% of the Earth's land and the Earth's oceans. And this is what many people equate the framework as. And it is indeed a huge commitment. Many countries had, in advance of the COP, agreed this, including Canada, joining what they called a high ambition coalition of countries, which still exists today with respect to implementation. This is a busy slide. The main reason for displaying is because to show that the 23 targets are much more than just protected areas. While that is an important underpinning, there are so many other kinds of targets that reduce threats to biodiversity, meet human requirements through sustainable use, and give tools and solutions for implementation. So, you know, we have to talk about directly staving off by species decline, combating alien species, pollution, sustainable agriculture, subsidies, and so forth. So it's very complex. So what's next? It's up to individual countries to implement. Canada did not start out very strongly. I mean, Canada did start out very strongly back in 1992. It was one of the first signers of the convention, came up with a biodiversity strategy since then. But since then, the progress really stalled. You know, there are no current biodiversity strategies by Ontario or any other province in play. And so there's a lot of work to do. The great thing is that Canada has a great amount of global opportunity. From a global perspective, we're in an excellent position. We're a developed country with still quite a lot of intact habitat, intact forests, intact landscapes, even though we still are hungry for resource development in those areas. So we're at a turning point in this respect, and also to consider biodiversity and conservation together. These are the homelands of Indigenous nations who can take leadership roles, can and are taking leadership roles. So the opportunity from a global scale is huge. Canada made some big commitments itself. It showed up very well at the COP15 in terms of global leadership, both on Indigenous conservation. This is my colleague, Valerie Courtois, of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative on the left, but also our Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, was very important for reaching resolution and also galvanizing this extraordinary event in such a short period of time. We have a lot of work to do, but we've got a lot of material to do with it. Thank you so much. And I give it over to Mitchell.
Belated Happy New Year, everybody, and thank you so much for including me in this panel and getting to present and work alongside Justina. It's just been a joy over the last couple of weeks, so thank you for that as well. I've been asked to cover the hits and misses in COP27 and talk a little bit about the connections back and forth between COP27 and 15, although Justina's already pointed to those connections and intersections as well. I purposely put these square brackets in the title of my session, and I showed this to my wife last night, and she said, you know, that's awfully obscure. And yes, it is, and that's the reason I did it. Square brackets are the device that is used in a UN climate negotiation, or I later learned a UN biodiversity negotiation, I guess any negotiating forum, where there are multiple different views on how a decision should be reached, on how a policy or a program should be implemented. And you will see documents with thousands of sets of square brackets, 72 or 96 sleepless hours before the conference is supposed to end. And so I know it goes that way in every climate COP. Justina would know a lot better than I would, but my impression was that it went that way with COP15 as well. And it is a really obscure, difficult process for anybody who doesn't live, eat, and breathe it every day, and probably for people who do. So taking that insight into COP27, we heard Justina say that the climate treaty is a lot more robust and has made a lot more progress than the Convention on Biological Diversity. And yet in the last 24 hours or so, we've heard the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, say that we're facing a 5-alarm global fire calling for an avalanche of action. And I think both of those things are true, but what it really goes back to is something that Justina referred to as well, and that is that the success or failure of any of these conferences is down to what 195 countries can reach consensus on, all of them negotiating from their own national interest and trying to find the global interest in doing that. And I think maybe the starting point is that both things are true about that process, that it's absolutely awful. However, it turns out the process itself, it's hard to imagine anything messier or more exhausting or fraught or frankly scary given the stakes. And it's the best humanity's been able to come up with for trying to get consensus among 195 countries. And if there's time, I'll come back to that a little bit at the end of my segment. So COP27, Just as target 3 was sort of the top line result of COP15, what we all heard about in COP27 was that finally, countries reached agreement on a process for dealing with the issue of loss and damage. And it ended up being described, or we saw it described, we described it in our publication as a stunning victory wrapped in a wider disaster. But to understand that framing, you have to take a step back first into what loss and damage refers to, as I think many people on this call, but possibly not everybody knows. The main pillars of climate action are internationally are mitigation, which is driving down greenhouse gas emissions, and then adaptation, which, as the name implies, means adapting to the impact of climate change. Mitigation is recovery, and that's because nobody wants to use the word compensation, because then the United States will leave the table. It's recovery from the impacts that there's no way that you can adapt to. It's things like the seas are rising so fast that our country's going to disappear, whatever we do, even at 1.5 degrees. You can't adapt to that. The country's gone. There's at least one country currently looking for land to relocate itself as a country. That's loss and damage. Again, still with sea level rise, the seas have risen enough that the saltwater infiltration has made it impossible to farm. We've literally salted the earth. We can no longer grow food. That's not something you can adapt to just by shoveling up the soil and replacing it, or I'd probably revealed myself as not somebody who's ever worked on a farm when I say that. That calls for loss and damage. And so the discussion on this file dates back literally decades. It's been a source of frustration, of anger, of the most stunning sense of betrayal from countries that are on the front lines of the climate emergency right now. So finally, this year in Sharm-el Sheikh, Egypt, in November, at an African COP, it was only the third time the COP had been held on African soil, people were determined that if one thing happened at COP27, that loss and damage would get dealt with, and it did after a fashion. What actually happened was that the countries agreed by consensus to set up a dedicated fund and form a transitional fund that they would operationalize over the next year. The committee working on that plan is actually going to hold its first meeting in March, and they'll report back to COP28 next year at the United, or later this year in the United Arab Emirates, with recommendations on how to proceed. If that sounds like a lot of talk and a lot of delay, that's because it is. And that's the best outcome you're going to get from that kind of process. We'll agree to keep on talking. We'll agree to set up the funds, but we don't have time in these 2 weeks of back-to-back sleepless night negotiations. We don't have time to get agreement on what in COP speak they like to call the methods and modalities. So that's about as good as it gets. And yet, it could have been a lot better. This is what almost happened. A few days before the end, the European Union proposed a grand bargain. They said that an immediate loss and damage fund should be set up on condition that countries also agreed to peak their emissions by 2025. To anybody outside the COP process, this is what they should have done at COP1, except by then they wouldn't have had to wait until 2025. And yet this proposal immediately ran into the politics back and forth between countries, the politics back and forth between blocks of countries. One of the issues about peaking emissions is that that's a challenging target for anybody, but considered unjust for developing countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change and are still also at an earlier stage in economic development. The argument from that part of the world is that the rich countries have benefited historically, as we know, from the fossil fuel era. Therefore, it should be on the rich countries to lead. So this proposal sounded like perfect, wonderful, glorious common sense, and that's why it didn't proceed. The rest of the story, beyond our stunning victory wrapped in a wider disaster, at the very last minute, there was a surprise blessing for fossil gas as a what some people still call natural gas, as a key element of decarbonization process. And it later transpired that when the 195 countries voted to adopt the final text, not everybody had had time to read that passage, so they voted on it without knowing that it was there. They reaffirmed a soft commitment to 1.5 degrees Celsius as an end target, but it was just a soft commitment and no advance over the previous year. There has still been no success on the $100 billion per year in climate finance that the rich countries promised developing countries in 2009. It was supposed to begin in 2020. Deliberations are still underway on what climate finance will look like after 2024. They agreed to keep on talking about climate adaptation and resilience. Are you seeing a theme here? At a time when vulnerable countries are already diverting significant portions of their GDP from essentials like health and education to pay for climate adaptation that they need to do right now. It's literally metaphorically, you know, I know we promised you a school, but it won't do you very much good if we don't build this seawall first. So your 5-year-old's gonna have to wait, I don't know, maybe till she's 15. That'll work for you, right? That'll be okay. And so there's supposed to be a decision next year on doubling adaptation finance. And I've only been attending or following the climate COP process since 2015. So I can't tell you how long people have been negotiating and advocating for adequate adaptation funding. And there was, again, lots of conversation among world leaders about food security, vulnerable community, just transition. But as far as I know, no really concrete results on those points. We heard some searing voices from the floor. Alok Sharma was actually a minister in the Boris government, the Boris Johnson cabinet in the United Kingdom until he left his cabinet post to become COP26 president. He's recently, in the last week or two, I think, been knighted for his effort on that conference. And this was his, according to news reports, visibly angry comment at the end of COP27. And you can read it here. Emissions peaking before 2025, not in the text. Clear follow through on the coal phase down, not in this text. Clear commitment to phase out fossil fuels, not in this text. The energy text weakened in the final minute. So this is a measure of what happened from somebody who has seen the process from the inside, who well understands that the role of the COP president is to put aside your own country's national interest. There's a whole diplomatic group that will take care of that. You're there to look at the greater good and negotiate the best deal by consensus that you can. And sort of longer story than there's probably time to dig into, but as COP27 unfolded, the contrast between Sharma and his successor from Egypt, Shukri, was just so evident. Where Sharma started trying to broker the deal months before, traveling around to meet with the different delegations and blocs, Egypt got started very late. The moment they ran into problems, the COP president basically washed his hands of it and said, okay, it's up to you people to decide this now. And meanwhile, Egypt was making it very clear that they wanted COP27 to be their platform to promote their country as a source of fossil gas. That's Shana, the Minister of Environment for the Republic of Maldives. Why are we celebrating loss and damage when we've failed on mitigation and adaptation? We're just a meter above sea level. I want my 2-year-old daughter to live in the Maldives. Laurence Tubiano, who was one of the architects of the Paris Agreement in 2015, now the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. The influence of the fossil fuel industry was found across the board. At COP26 in Glasgow, the fossil industry had the largest single delegation at the conference, larger than any single national delegation. And you know, I wasn't there, so I shouldn't speculate, but I'm pretty sure they weren't advocating for a faster fossil fuel phase out. You know, if anybody's seen otherwise, I would love to hear it. That would be front page news for us. At COP27, they had 100 more delegates than that. And a large number of them came from the United Arab Emirates, which is hosting COP28 later this year and has just announced that the CEO of their national oil company, ADNOC, is going to be the COP28 president. So it's the first time any CEO, much less a fossil CEO, has taken the presidency of a COP. And Elizabeth Marema, this takes us back full circle to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Climate is a primary driver of biodiversity loss, and yes, climate action depends on biodiversity as part of the solution. So clearly the two are linked and cannot be separated, which is the whole theme and the whole point of our session today. So the biodiversity side of climate is not one of my main areas of specialty. So rather than taking up a lot of your time with this slide, I'm going to go through it very quickly and then open the floor so that we can have a conversation. But certainly I know that one of the things people were hoping for coming into the two conferences was that COP27 would set forward momentum, would set what, again, in COP speak, they like to call the direction of travel, and really get something useful and worthwhile and meaningful done as a way of priming the space, if you will, for what needed to happen at COP15. In the end, I would say that COP27 failed to do that, and COP15 achieved what it did without a whole lot of help from the other side of the house. Again, the climate-nature connection is something that you just heard Justina refer to, and a lot better than I can. But something that we do watch on the climate side is a number of the false starts and greenwashing and complexities that come in when we start to see climate and nature activities either intersect or collide. First of all, as I'm sure many of you know, there is so much talk of carbon offsets. And I don't think it's true that a carbon offset is necessarily greenwashed. I actually know of a few good ones. The problem is that the whole approach depends so much on both knowledge and goodwill on the part of both the organizations offering and the organizations buying, that the process is very vulnerable to greenwashing, and it happens very often and too often. A lot of the time you will hear fossil companies in particular say, okay, sure, look, we're going to hit net zero by 2050. And you know what's even better? We're planting a bunch of trees. When the analysis and the modeling are all very clear that that trade-off is in itself a lie. We do need the carbon sequestration and a lot more than we're getting now from natural landscapes of all kinds. And we need to draw down fossil fuel production. Whereas almost invariably, when you hear a fossil company talking about this, they're saying that they're going to go for the offset so that they can continue extracting and continue increasing their extraction. The rights of Indigenous and local communities are so essential to both processes. And I was so glad that Val Kurtwell was on the slide that you showed earlier, Justina. And so often, those landholders and rights holders are harassed, displaced, killed, particularly when the natural spaces that in many cases they've been connected to for millennia and have taken care of for millennia, when those natural spaces are assigned a monetary value. So once again, if an offset says, hey, there are dollars involved now in this land, that makes things really complicated and very often make things very dangerous. There's a really complex story around biofuels. It's complex enough that frankly, we don't cover it very much because there's so much risk that we'll get the story wrong. But just to say that there is a world of difference, light years of difference between a local biogas digester that a farm co-op installs to make better use of the waste that's generated in place versus an operation in British Columbia recently documented by the Tyee, if I remember correctly, or by the Narwhal, I believe, where a company is taking down old growth forest in BC and turning those trees into wood pellets for export to the United Kingdom so that the UK can say that they're using a sustainable fuel. Those are both bioenergy, and one of them, at least potentially, is viable and legitimate and necessary, and the other one, the adjectives don't fit into light company.
Thank you so much for that presentation. One thing I wanted to ask you is I made a case for why Canada can be quite a global leader on the biodiversity side. What do you see as Canada's role with respect to leadership, and what was it at the COP, and what can it be as we move forward on climate in particular?
On climate, I think a lot of the difficulty Canada faces is, first of all, that the decisions are split so much between federal and provincial governments And secondly, that the politics, as we all know, are so fraught. There's a lot of skepticism right now, a lot of disappointment in the climate community about what Canada is and is not getting done. And the bottom line fact is that our emissions are maybe just starting to level off, but even if that's happening at the time when emissions need to start falling and keep falling very fast. We've seen the federal government put lots of programs, lots of systems, lots of institutions in place. That takes time. It seems to me as though they're moving quite deliberately from the what. You know, let's pass this legislation, let's get this declaration in place, let's get this Accountability Act done, let's, you know, get carbon pricing through the Supreme Court. Moving on from that into, so how do we actually implement this? And I think the real test of both their seriousness and their ability to deliver on it is going to be how they get that done on issues ranging this year from just transition to the oil and gas emissions cap. Justina, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I was hearing during COP15 that struck me as a phenomenal contrast between the two conferences, the two processes, was that I heard that when corporate interests showed up at COP15, they weren't looking to obstruct. They were actually advocating for a strong and ambitious result. My impression was that that was because these were companies that got it, that their success in business depended on nature and biodiversity and on preventing the extinction crisis. But they were concerned that if they were the first to move, then their competitors who were being less responsible would have a financial advantage over them. In contrast to fossil fuel companies showing up at the climate COP, and you've already heard me hold forth about that. In our conversation, we each have a different perception of each other's side of the house, but how did that play out at COP15?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there was a lot of corporate interest, and that reflects the fact that, you know, it's only recently that corporations have included or being thought or thinking about biodiversity in the context of, you know, sort of the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance frameworks, corporate social responsibility, and so forth. But it's early days, and you know, this what you describe also reflects that, you know, this diffuse nature of biodiversity. People still don't really know what they need to do in order to address it. It's hard to measure, and you know, it affects local. You know, it affects companies and their activities on the ground more than the centrality of their business, which was a real contrast with climate, and that's been decades long. We're right from the start when it was realized that we have a climate emergency on our hands. You know, that was going to be completely, you know, affecting the economic bottom line of major, large transnational companies that have, you know, energy as the core component of their business, right? And that is a direct threat to those, in the sense that, you know, they have to tail that off in order to lead to emissions reductions that are absolutely required. On the biodiversity side, I think, as I said, it's early days. Companies are still optimistic that, you know, you can do still what you want to do with just paying a bit more attention from a mitigation perspective. But there's a real possibility, because, you know, at the root of both crises is overconsumption of resources and so forth from you know, planetary boundaries, and that you know, companies won't be able to do business as usual you know, when it comes to development that impacts land and biodiversity, and that you know, even though there have been very few, if any, limits to development in our current laws and policies, that might have to happen in the future. It very well may, and probably will happen in the future, and that's where we might see some more threats to the bottom line, and we might see a little bit more changes, but hopefully not. Hopefully this goodwill will continue.
As you say that one, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Mitchell.
No, after you. As you were saying that, what I was sort of thinking through is that, once again, on the climate side, there is, I guess, a continuum. where yes, if your business is to extract fossil fuels, and inherently this is a product that fries the planet when used directed, climate action is an existential threat unless you can somehow learn a whole other new line of business while still pursuing the one and scaling back the older one. Whereas once you move out of that core activity for a bank or a pension fund, for example, there's a perception in Canada right now among the financial community that they are threatened by the transition off carbon. But in theory, once they get with the program, it should be easier for the finance sector to move off and starve the fossils of capital as they go. It should be easier for them to move something new to somebody who actually holds the physical assets that does the extraction. And then farther down, there would be other sectors that are less tied in, less beholden. Do you see that same kind of division? And again, I don't know the biodiversity space well enough to say, but for example, would it be easier for a consumer goods company than a forestry company to really seriously take on board the results of COP15?
Not necessarily. I mean, forestry companies have historically paid much more attention than almost any industry, and it's been embedded in certification processes and so on. But I think it's going to be universal in the sense that because overall much more attention is being paid. And once we have better foundation for measuring, it's going to affect a lot of companies. And also there is the understanding too, similar to on the climate side, that it's not just about direct impacts, but also indirect impacts or so-called dependencies on biodiversity and the natural environment that may not be directly right in the business, but happening through supply chain and so forth, and that complicates and then makes also more clear the extent of impacts that we have to be grappling with. There are no rules for stemming the tide of production, if you will, and consumption. We generally, all of our regulations and laws and policies meant to mitigate biodiversity loss and so forth are really about, on the edges of the problem, really trying to make harm less bad than it otherwise would be. So it's reactive, and much more attention will need to be paid to the so-called limits of production and consumption at the other end. And I think that's the case for both biodiversity and climate, which I also hope will be much more in sync with each other. They're fundamentally the same problem in the sense of, how they came about, but they are addressed entirely independently by different actors. And that's improving, but it still has a long way to go.
Let me just start with a question about how Canada can manage provincial governments who seem to be ignoring the fact that the federal government has signed treaties in relation to biodiversity and climate change. I think probably a good example of that is the Greenbelt in Ontario, and the fact that the provincial government is happy to get rid of wetlands in order to do development, whereas that's in opposition to the direction that the federal government's taking by signing these treaties. So maybe you could both address that, because it affects biodiversity and climate change.
So underlying that is that natural resources are in the Constitution as provincial responsibility, and from that is generally the interpretation of that, and how it's exercised is that includes wildlife, includes, there much of the land base in the provinces, including Ontario, is governed by Ontario, and treaties were signed a long time ago, and are now being, with increasing frequency across the settled treaties from BC to BC, in the sort of the under the territories, so to speak, are being increasingly challenged by First Nations for the fact that cumulative effects of land use development and piecemeal decision making is violating treaty rights, and have had quite a lot of success with that. So I do think that is shifting. Back to the central part of the question, any kind of the implementation of what Canada committed to in Montreal is going to absolutely require cooperation of provinces, and there's a spectrum of interest by current provinces in that enterprise. And a couple of announcements were made at the COP that related to, for example, leadership, Indigenous leadership that was, where there were funding announcements, Guardians programs, but also nature agreements with one or two of the provinces, and some are forthcoming, so that you can bring together the various, strengths for willing provinces. It's going to be very, very difficult, though. It continues to be, in terms of provinces who are not interested in some of these goals and targets. There's no doubt about that, but it continues to be a challenge, but that can't stand in the way. That's as much as I can say. I don't know, Mitchell, if you have more.
The only other piece that comes to mind just briefly is that, yes, obviously it's going to be very difficult with so many provinces for the foreseeable future. In Ontario, with Bill 23 is one of the best examples. The sort of the only longer approach, apart from electoral change, that comes to mind is for groups in our communities, in the climate and in the biodiversity communities, to be trying to work outside our own bubbles, to find other interests, other sectors, other organizations that for their own reasons would not only be supportive of those agreements being implemented the way they need to be, but supportive enough and concerned and interested enough that they would express themselves, and go forward to governments, to opposition parties as unusual suspects that they never dreamt they would hear from, and ideally who are a core part of their constituency. So, for example, the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, which I don't think is unexpected, but it's definitely largely conservative constituency, is promising to keep up the fight on Bill 23. That's excellent, because they, for better and for worse, I think they would probably have a lot more clout a lot of the time than many of us. And so building those kinds of alliances beyond where we normally have our conversation won't bring results tomorrow, but the sooner we start, the sooner it will.
Great. Are the provinces ever, did they ever attend the COPs, or is it just the federal government?
Yes.
Subnational yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Mitchell.
One word answer.
Yes, different levels of some ministers from provinces attended COP15, and in other cases they sent more from the civil service. So but subnational governments are definitely represented at these COPs.
Okay.
Canada also had quite a strong municipal presence at COP27. And within the climate COP processes, there is a lot of interest in engaging with subnational government.
Great. So there's a question about the term loss and damage, which is seen to be a very legal term. Mm-hmm. And that sort of the suggestion is that kind of scares off some countries, especially the United States, who are so litigious in the first place. So why not change the language and call it something like an adaptation fund instead of a more legal term that gets the backs up of people?
It isn't so much that it's legalistic per se. The concern by the countries that have been responsible for by far the lion's share of the emissions historically and are the home base for companies that have been the major perpetrators. The concern is not so much the legalities of the compensation. As recently as the last week, the UN climate envoy, John Kerry, has been in the news saying, no, we're not going to agree to compensation. And I think it was the COP21 in Paris in 2015 that the US almost walked away from the table. There were a few points, I think, when they almost walked away from the table, but in this case, they were concerned that if they agreed to the text of the Paris Agreement as it had then been drafted around the square brackets, that their companies would, or their government for that matter, might be on the hook for compensation. And after months of having helped lead the negotiations and the brokering and the arm twisting leading up to Paris, the US was set to walk away, even though developing countries had agreed weeks or months before that at that point in time, the compensation wasn't something they were going to ask for. the US wanted it taken off the table forever and for all time so that it could never be negotiated again, which I gather is considered really bad form in international negotiating. But it's always been about the money more than the legality. It's been about ExxonMobil is headquartered in Texas, therefore it's our job to protect them.
Okay. Thanks. And Alan noted that, and this sort of relates to your comment about natural gas versus fossil gas, that changing the language can change the story. And as a journalist, I think you probably know a bit about that.
As a writer, I have really mixed feelings about this, and I've been pulled into the occasional argument about it, and I think probably offended some people without wanting to. We have been gradually shifting our language on the mix to talk more about fossil gas, but I always try to do it in a way that still explains to people what we're talking about. Because yeah, there's nothing about gas that's natural except for the fact that it has been underground for 1 million or so years and should stay there. But if most people don't know what we're talking about when we say fossil gas, we don't achieve anything. We just reveal ourselves as insiders, which is not a really good way of communicating outside our bubble. So it's a dilemma. You know, my preference is to use language people will actually understand and open the door for further conversation so that more things become clear. But we are starting to use fossil gas more.
Great. Thanks. Can you
There's no right answer.
Yeah, there's no right answer. Okay. Can you both sort of discuss the carbon capture and storage and its feasibility in reducing emissions, and in light of the fact that Canada seems to be putting a lot of weight on this as a strategy, and which generally is considered to be a unproven technology. Is this
Justina, do you want to address natural sequestration first? And
yeah, I think I'll do that, because I didn't actually talk about CCUS, although I have some views on that. But I think one central part of the answer to that question is that we have quite a few natural systems that currently store carbon, and that our models depend on that as sort of a background process. So, for example, one fantastic example is peatlands, which store thousands of years of carbon, and Canada has 25% of the world's peatlands in our country. So that's a really great illustration of Canada's outsized responsibility. The problem is that because it's sort of a background process in a lot of the models, it's taken for granted, which means that, most of the attention is on, emissions reductions, as it should be, from industrial sector, transportation, buildings, and so on. But in order to be successful with those, you don't want to undermine those efforts by then digging up the carbon in some of these northern areas. Peatlands is a fantastic example of that. And so Peter and Paul kind of have to work together. That's a very good example of where nature and climate have to be, working together. Maybe you can then talk about CCUS specifically, Mitchell.
Sure. Thanks very much. What I was saying during my segment is that those absolutely essential natural processes get a lot more complicated, and not in a good way, when we start monetizing them, right? So if somebody were to say, well, this impoverished community that has these peatlands in its, I'm making up this example, but this impoverished northern community that has peatlands on its territory, hey, great, you can get revenue for sequestering that. At some point, as those other interests get involved, very often elsewhere in the world, those kinds of offset or payment systems have taken an essential and a perfectly good system and made it not so good in a lot of situations. All of that is distinct from CCS, carbon capture and storage, or CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage. That is where technology is bolted onto a fossil fuel plant, or it can be another high emitter like a steel or a nitrogen fertilizer plant. And the emissions are taken out of the system as they're produced, piped somewhere, or I suppose trucked somewhere, and then buried underground. There are multiple economic and technical problems with the process that would be a webinar in itself, so I won't go there. But the short form is, first of all, that as recently as I think the beginning of 2021, about 81% of the captured carbon was being used in a process called enhanced oil recovery, where it's injected underground into depleted oil wells so that fossil companies will be able to get more oil out. So Peter and Paul were saying, hey, we captured all this carbon. We're saints, right? We're going to inject it underground to extract more carbon. And yet we're going to claim that we're reducing carbon. Even now, to its credit, with the way the Canadian government's carbon capture and storage tax credit has been set up, they've excluded enhanced oil recovery from eligibility. The fossil industry is actively lobbying to get that decision reversed, but right now it's down. The main problem beyond that with CCUS is, first of all, that technically it is not nearly as mature or as ready for prime time as the industry claims. There was a major study that was done by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. They looked at the top 13 flagship CCS projects around the world. And it should tell you something that it only took 13 of these projects to represent 55% of global capacity. 10 of the 13 projects were failing to one degree or another, up to and including having to be mothballed. Even if all goes really well for the industry, they'll be capturing about 0.1% of global emissions by, I don't know, the middle or the end of this decade. So, so that's where that stands.
Yeah,
it would
really
be
good.
great. It would be great if this technology does work and does scale up more, but not to promote more production. I mean,
Right.
that is in a spread, in the name of efficiency. But we really have to be looking at, overall intense, the end product is, it would be continue to be a disaster if we continue growing those and exploiting those oil fields.
Okay.
Sorry, Michael, just quickly,
Yeah.
when you hear fossil companies say that they're going to be net zero by 2050, what they really mean is that they plan to continue increasing their extraction at least through 2033, when every serious report says they just cannot be doing that.
Right. And
then offset it
Yeah.
with CCS or with buying trees or whatever they choose to do, and it's not going to work.
Right. Good. Thank you. This will probably be the last question, I imagine, Joanne. You're doing the timing, but Justina, could you comment on genetically modified foods, which might, theoretically help plants be more resilient to climate change, but are going to harm nature's balance?
Yeah, this is actually not my area of expertise at all, except that, we cannot be, from what I know, it's impossible to have one position about genetically modified food. It completely depends on the situation and the circumstances. So that's not going to be something that I'm going to be able to sort of make a general comment about. It's something that cannot be just sort of let loose without regulation, but at the same time, there's got to be much more study and understanding. I mean, the fact is that we've got a lot of people on this planet that we need to feed. There's been a lot of genetic modification already of crops that have allowed us to use less land in certain circumstances. And so we have to be open to those kind of possibilities as long as we understand their impacts on the natural capital that we have and our dependency on that.
Michael, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, great. So this is about sort of solutions that are sort of a bit outside of your areas of expertise, but it's related to the recent election in Ontario that sort of less than 18% of eligible electorate elected this Ontario government, and whether electoral reform is something that is essential to prevent this disastrous environment and biodiversity crisis that we're facing. So if you just comment on any considerations that maybe are missing in that sort of interpretation of the need for electoral reform.
Do you want to take that, Mitchell?
Sure. It's not my area of expertise, so of course I'm going to hold forth on it, right? It comes up so often in any online gathering of people who are frustrated and scared and determined to do something about it, we all say, oh, if only we could reform the electoral system. I don't disagree. My question back is, given the deadlines we're under, and I mean this as an and, not an or.
Mhm.
While we're all saying, yes, absolutely, it was a betrayal 2015. I remember 2015, what a betrayal, right? We've got what we've got. In the time it'll take us to change out the electoral system, we'll hit the 2030 deadlines and we won't have it done. So my question to all of us is, we'll stipulate the system isn't working, and within that system, what more can we, all of us, be doing every single day, not just to communicate, but to listen outside the bubble, so that we can get a sense of who were those voters that elected Doug Ford in his hinch vote, and what was it that they were hearing that the Ford campaign brain trust was hearing that we weren't, because many of us were involved in that campaign in one way or another, and it didn't help. So how do we connect better? We're on a 3-year deadline for next time.
Thank you so much for that discussion. We're now going to talk about action of the day. So here's Karen.
So in 2018, our premier said he'd keep his hands off the Greenbelt. But by last December, 7,400 acres of land had been removed from the protection of the Greenbelt, and Bill 23, More Homes Built Faster, had passed. I think what's most egregious about Bill 23 is it strips powers from conservation authorities, takes out some of their land, and it overrides decisions made by municipal and regional councils to limit urban expansion. So what can we do? The fight has not ended, which is really interesting, because people who don't normally get involved, I think, are going to rallies and they're signing petitions. So we can take action ourselves. I think one of the most interesting things to do is request a lawn sign for your a Greenbelt Promise lawn sign. You can send an email to this email, and these are all in the chat. If you're in a condo like me, I've got some neighbors who've agreed to take some lawn signs. Stay informed. And this was one of the things that Justina, when we talked, had said, be aware, stay informed. And you can join tomorrow night a webinar that Peter Tabbins, an MPP, is hosting, along with lawyers from Eco-Justice and Environmental Defense. Eco-Justice and Environmental Defense are actually taking the province to court, and you'll get some updates and some pushback strategies. The link is also here and in the chat. Thursday, tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Finally, there are pop-up rallies coming all over the province. There's one on Monday, January 23rd at 12 noon at the Sheraton Centre Hotel. And you can find other rallies and lots of other information on a website called Greenbelt Promise, which is really helpful because it is bringing together the actions of groups around the province. So keep the fight going. Don't give up. Some of your action on this one is really important. It's unlike, I think, a lot of things that we've seen the Ford government do. You're going to be joined by a lot of people who are concerned. Thanks.
On behalf of CALL, I want to thank Justina and Mitchell for the generous giving of your time. It was very much appreciated. Your presentations were excellent and very informative. I was very pleased to hear, Justina, that you started your presentation by saying that biodiversity is a very complex and not well understood issue, because that very much reflected my own thoughts. And because I've perceived it, and I don't think I'm alone in this, as being so complex, I found very much that I was kind of avoiding really getting into the issue and following it. But with the knowledge I've gained today, I feel now that I can better approach this topic. I have some understanding now of what biodiversity means and its relationship with climate change, which I was very muddled in my thinking about. So again, I know I'm not alone now with that. And so thank you so much for your very informative talk. I also want to take a moment to thank some people from the leadership team, especially a special thank you to Joanne Hunter, who is the lead of our nature-based solution interest group. Joanne introduced this topic, this important topic, to the leadership team. She sought out our guest speakers, and she was the overall producer of today's event. She's been working really hard, I know, for the last few months. And as the kids say, a big shout out to Joanne. I also want to thank other members of the leadership team, Caroline Taylor, Karen Robbins, Michael Barkley, Judy Sheridan, and Sharon Zeiler, also working very hard behind the scenes to make this such a successful morning. So thank you all. So we are having our annual February town hall. It's going to be held on Wednesday, February the 1st, from 10 to 11:30. And the first Wednesday of the month is our usual time for our monthly learning meeting. The registration link is going to be in the chat. And the purpose of the town hall is it's an opportunity to join and meet your fellow call supporters and to catch up on what's been happening behind the scenes at call, what we've accomplished in this past year. You'll find out how you can get more involved in call if you so choose, lots of volunteer opportunities, and to share and discuss what's on your own climate action bucket list. So again, look for the link in the chat. At call, I'm sure most of you know who've been around for a while, that we don't have any fees at all, and as we believe that climate learning should be free to all. And for almost 3 years now, all the work from call has been done by volunteers, and all of our guest speakers have donated their time, and that will continue. Our costs have been very minimal, largely due to the David Suzuki Foundation, whose Future Ground network gives us no cost use of their mailing and database system and their Zoom account, which we're using today, for example. So our costs have been minimal, but this year there will be some costs as we feel that it's critical that we set up a website. We have a significant library of presentations and video recordings, and we want to make these materials accessible for everyone for free. And so we are going to be setting up a website. And of course, there are some minor costs associated with that for training, designing, and hosting the website. And so in order to do that, we have posted a fundraising campaign at the Small Change Fund, and the link will be posted in the chat. So it's very simple to make a donation. We've had a couple of people already do so, and we've gotten really good feedback. It's very simple, straightforward, and tax receipts will be provided. So we're hoping I know there's a lot of people here who are not necessarily members or supporters of call. And if you're new and you'd like to join, you can join us, and in doing so, you'll receive our monthly newsletter, invitations to our meetings, and you can again look up for the sign up link. It will be in the chat. You can reach us anytime at our email address, and there it's underlined, contact us at climatelearners.ca. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about call, about joining. This is new information about the Small Change Fund. So any inquiries, please feel free to reach out. We're available. We want to hear from you, and we'll get back to you promptly. And as I said, the website will be coming in early 2023. So that's it for today. And we're hoping, we always have an after chat, just informal chat. And please stay and join us. And thank you all for coming today. It was a great morning. Thanks again.